When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and
welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Bret McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever time you're listening to this, we welcome you to Iron Rhetoric, where we seek to apply biblical Christianity to all of life. We're thankful that you're tuning in. We know that there are a host of podcasts out there that you could possibly be listening to, and we're thankful for the time that you give us here. Tonight, we're going to continue where we've left off, and that is reviewing Jeremy Carl's book titled The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. What Carl does here is he examines what we might call the great replacement theory. Like people like to mock as being a tinfoil hat type of belief, but yet you can find all kinds of substantiation of the theory by top-flight politicians and entertainment figures who do talk about the white people needing to be replaced. And we're seeing that increasingly in America today as we note the immigration numbers, as we note the numbers falling of population per capita of white people in America. Keep in mind, when I was born in 1959, the population of white people in America was somewhere in the vicinity of 88, 89%. Now we're down to, I think the last figure I saw was something like 57%, 60%, depending on what you're reading. It's gotten so bad that people are now identifying on the census reports. They're going out of their way to identify as not being white, even if they are white. Because what do they understand? They understand there are benefits to be had by being minority. Or it's kind of ironic we still use the term minority because actually it's the whites who are increasingly the minority in America. And we've been looking at this book by Jeremy Carl. I'm not sure, but I think the tactic our enemies are using, the Antichrist, the progressives, the cultural Marxists, whatever category you want to drop them in, I think the tactic that they're using with this book is to drop it down the memory hole. You see some people reviewing it and talking about it, but it certainly isn't getting the kind of attention that you might think this kind of book would get. And so I think the tactic that they're using is to drop it in the memory hole. I'm a little familiar with that because when my book came out, Saved to be Warriors, it likewise was dropped down the memory hole, and it's a convenient tactic to avoid material that is really stinging your position. We're on chapter 4 now, and we have a special guest with us today, Reverend Sam Perry, who is an elder at Charlotte Christ the King Reformed Church and the associate assistant pastor there. And we're glad to have Sam today. Actually, it was Sam who turned me on to this book. I didn't know about it. He was reading it. In our conversations, he made a reference to it. I said, what? There's a book that talks about this subject? I got to know about that book. And so he told me, sent me the link, and I bought the book. And I think between the time he told me about it and the time I finished reading, it might have been a week to 10 days. It's a really good book. And so we welcome Sam Perry to the broadcast this evening on Iron Rhetoric. And the chapter we're looking at today is the chapter 4, if you have the book, There Goes the Neighborhood. And I'll just open it up at this point just to get a little bit of feedback from Sam on what he thought about this chapter in general.
Well, I think one of the first things I wanted to point out that you were just mentioning is that whenever we talk about neighborhoods and that sort of thing, the whole conversation about white flight, of course, is a big part of that conversation. And obviously the reasons behind it are far more nuanced. We'll talk about that tonight. But I was just listening to another sociologist on a different podcast, Steve Saylor, and he was saying some of the same things and was mentioning the whole flight from whiteness, what you were just saying, that because of the benefits that are there, people are more and more on these censuses saying we're not white or trying to distance themselves from their own whiteness.
Right. And you can find Steve Saylor quite a bit on VDare as well as other places. And Saylor has been chipping away at this subject for quite some time. He's well hated. He's another guy, though, I think they try to drop down the memory hole. Steve Saylor, along with others, is part of the reason why the cultural Marxists, the left, is trying to destroy VDARE. VDARE has done a great work. Do we remember the name of the chap that runs that organization? He used to work for William Buckley's organization, and we might find that out later. But they're trying to run him out of Dodge. And if you can support VDARE, it'd be good to do that. When we look at this chapter 4, there goes the neighborhood. Sam mentioned the idea of white flight, but we should tee this up by saying the overall subject of what he's getting at in chapter 4 is the narrative that obviously whites are racist, as seen in the fact that when blacks move into neighborhoods that were predominantly white, then whites begin to travel, to fly away, to get away. He opens the chapter by noting several cities where the demographics changed very quickly from white density population to black density populations. He talks a lot about the urban areas. Chicago is the city that he starts with, and he quotes from Michelle Obama, who is herself a cultural Marxist of a great degree, and of course she rides the hobby horse of racism in order to drive the electorate in the direction that she wants. And he quotes her by saying, I want to remind white folks that y'all were running from us. This family with all the values that you've read about, you were running from us, and you're still running. Values. It's funny that Michael, whichever it is. It's funny that she would talk about values, given the fact that Michael, whatever it is what she is. But the thrust of his chapter at the beginning is, look, it wasn't about white flight, and the stories that have been told here have been told through this cultural Marxist prism, this neo-left narrative, and it is, in doing so, it has made the white man just to be this horrible, racist, ugly creature who runs away every time he sees color. Ooh, I can't stand that. But indeed, the point that he makes out, and again, Jeremy Carl is very guilty of noticing. So if you don't like the sin of noticing, you don't want to read Jeremy Carl's book, because he commits the sin of noticing over and over again. And one thing that he notices is that it wasn't so much about blacks moving into white areas. It was about the fact that when blacks came, crime came with the black movement of population, and whites said, jeepers, I don't want to live in an area where I might get robbed, raped, or murdered. And so that's the way he tees it up.
Which is a completely sensible idea, right? I mean, it's fascinating to me how everything gets boiled down to a very unnuanced, it's just racism, over and over, no matter the subject, no matter what we're talking about demographically. But it's obviously, there's more to it. And it's interesting because I'm a product of public schools, and this is what I studied when we read about white flight. It was the racism of the white man. That was what was taught in schools.
Where did you read about that at? I mean, at what level?
Probably middle school and high school.
Really?
Yeah.
And what? Remind me again what you graduated?
It was the 70s. I graduated mid-80s.
Huh. I never came across that. Did you attend a big city in a big city?
No, Midland, which is a very, very, very white town. In fact, one of the few black families in the whole city lived next door to us. But it was very white.
I find that fascinating. I didn't to learn that it was even being discussed when you were you were in school.
Yep.
Was your high school white too then?
Yeah, predominantly.
Interesting. All right, so he goes on to make this observation that we've noted, and we should say at the outset here that, and we've said this before, but understand something that Carl doesn't say that we need really to say in order to put this in the broadest possible understanding, is that this warfare against white people is really a proxy war. It's not really about white people. What it's really about is rolling Jesus Christ off his throne. And the reason that they're going after white people is it's because in God's economy, according to God's providence, completely by God's grace, it's been the white people, white European civilization, white Christian civilization that has been perfumed with Jesus Christ. And so as Paul says, being perfumed with Jesus Christ, we are the smell of death to those who are perishing. And cultural Marxists, and we should say that the majority of cultural Marxists are white. The cultural Marxists hate that idea and so are trying to destroy white people, but really what they're going after is Christianity. Carl doesn't explicitly say that in his book, but you can't understand what's going on unless you understand that this is a proxy war. White people are being gone after because they bear the aroma of Christ, or at least historically that has been generally the case. Of course, obviously it's less and less the case as time goes by and cultural Marxism gets its grip upon us. But this is just one aspect, this white flight that we're talking about. One quote we want to know on page 53, if you have a book, is that a guy named Vogeli, who wrote about this, he says, as the South Shore, that's in Chicago, changed from a white neighborhood to a black one, it also changed from a safe neighborhood to a dangerous one, right? Racial turnover, he said, had already come to other Chicago neighborhoods in previous decades, and so white people were aware of a disquieting pattern. Rapid demographic change went hand in hand with higher crime, and as a result, lower property values. And to notice this was simply awareness of reality, not racism.
Now, of course, he has to add that in there. But the reality is, if you say something like this to anybody out there in the world right now, they immediately, their go-to is, that's racism.
Right, and that's the sin of what?
Noticing.
It's a sin of noticing. And the sin of noticing can get you hammered. I mean, we need to be aware of this sin of noticing. And that's why I'm surprised that Jeremy Carl hasn't, this book hasn't created more heat, because he notices all over the place. In every chapter he's noticing. But you can't be a noticer without getting hammered. I'm thinking of a chap who's increasingly becoming somebody I know better and better, named Michael Spangler. He committed the sin of noticing. And he made comments about feminism, and he made comments about the bagels. And they just ran him out of town in the most illicit way imaginable. So listeners, as you hear us discuss, understand that the sin of noticing is a great thing. There are certain truths out there that you cannot say, hey, I noticed that, or else you're just going to be decimated.
And it's even, you can't say, hey, I noticed that, when it's like the government's own statistics.
Right.
You're not even allowed to talk about that, especially if it paints negatively on the left-wing narrative.
Right. For example, a few years ago, there was a short booklet produced called The Color of Crime, and it mostly garnered its statistics from the FBI. And what they expose, again, the sin of noticing, what they expose about the nature and character of crime, the color of crime, was the obvious. And yet people just shrieked and shrilled over these hardcore objective realities. And that's the position that we're in. Now, what's interesting here that Carl brings out is that at the tail end of 54, he says that something interesting happened that nobody talks about, is that eventually over the course of time, first, of course, it was the whites who left, but then eventually as more lower and lower class blacks moved in and minorities, guess who moved out next? The middle class blacks. But yet nobody talks about that because that doesn't fit in the narrative of the mean, evil white guy. Anything you want to throw in here at this point, Sam?
Well, I mean, I think it is really striking that Chicago's murder rate of 10.5 per 100,000 residents in 1960 exploded to 28.7 by 1980 and continued to rise from there. So of course people are going to feel unsafe. That's a very noticeable. Those are noticeable statistics, and people are going to feel unsafe and want to live someplace safer. So it's, again, he says it's just a reasonable thing to want to move out, but the narrative is, and you know, I mean, as recently as Michelle Obama's autobiography, you know, it's just because they're evil and they're racist.
Right, and that continues to be the narrative today. What's interesting, we're going to get a little bit ahead of ourselves at this point, but that's okay. What's interesting is that later in this chapter, he'll say that white cultural Marxists, white upper class, white elites, if you please, they talk about all this, about how terrible white people are, about, you know, they're for immigration, they're for every program imaginable to help minorities, and yet they're the first ones to do what? To flee the neighborhoods. You know, so again, the hypocrisy is incredible, and we should note, again, I already slightly referenced it. the problem here isn't minorities exclusively. The problem is the white cultural Marxist progressive mindset that reinforces all this. It's in the political realm. It's in our denominations. It's everywhere, and so we're dealing with that reality. He talks a little bit about blockbusting. You want to tee that up, Sam?
Let's see. The history of blockbusting. So in the history of blockbusting, he's talking about the long time practice of breaking up neighborhoods which victimize the white middle class, unscrupulous real estate agents coming in, and even, I'd never heard of this before, but hiring black women with baby carriages to start walking down the neighborhood, start freaking out neighbors, starting simulated fights in the neighborhoods, causing people to want to get rid of their properties at a discounted rate to the benefit of those unscrupulous real estate agents.
Right, who were very likely white, we should say, at this point.
That's correct.
Yeah, again, so we want to keep emphasizing that this is, the white man has cut his own throat in many respects. Yeah, I had never heard of this. Had you ever heard of this before?
Nope, never.
I found that interesting that this phenomenon was such a big deal, and I hadn't come across it before. But again, it's called blockbusting, and Carl spends some time dealing with that. He says on page 55, in the wake of the Civil Rights Act and its adjunct provisions between 64 and 69, there were hundreds of riots in cities, disproportionately harming the property of white-owned businesses that in many cases were specifically targeted by the rioters. These are the minorities, according to the government's Kerner Commission report that came out in 1968. So again, there you find more reasons for whites to want to move elsewhere with their businesses. And indeed, what's ironic about this is that this rioting creates the very climate that so many people bewail, because businesses see this. They see businesses burned down. They see the looting that can go on. And what do they do in order to cover their costs? They raise their prices to cover the insurance costs, because the insurance is going up to cover doing business in a dilapidated or dangerous neighborhood. And so they're just getting more of what they decry by the rioting that's going on. And so Carl gives all kinds of statistics here about this blockbusting. It's just interesting, again, that it's a phenomenon I hadn't heard of. And he does know also here that the real victims here were the white people who were financially leveled. That is to say, they didn't have the resources to get out of the neighborhood, and so they were stuck. They couldn't get out, and they're the ones. It was usually the elderly. They're the ones that were getting eaten up by this tragedy, and that's the way it often goes. White people still to this day, if they have resources and finances, they can still practice to some degree white flight. But if you're middle class, if you don't have a lot of resources, and your neighborhood begins to change, well, it sucks to be you. And you just have to learn to live with it. By the way, this is where the book Bowling Alone comes in. And there's another guy, I can never remember that chap's name, who wrote Bowling Alone. But anyway, we've mentioned it here before. He started to write the book to disprove the idea that cultural diversity was a bad thing. He thought it wasn't true. But by the time he started doing all of his sociological investigations, he wrote a book that said, yes, diversity is something that causes people to hunker down, to not engage socially with one another, to protect themselves from all kinds of interactions with their neighborhoods, even among their own people, so to speak. And so we find this dynamic continuing.
That's Robert Putnam, by the way.
Robert Putnam.
And fascinating that still to this day, if you're of a class where you're able to get out of the neighborhood, you're the ones that we blame rather than the perpetrators that caused the white flight in the first place.
Right. And so one thing that's valuable here is that at least he's challenging the narrative. And it doesn't seem like anybody's willing to do, or very few people, I should say, are willing to challenge the narrative. If you're willing to challenge the narrative, then that's when you have to face the steamroller. That's one reason why I've come to respect Michael Spangler so much, because he was willing to challenge the narrative, and he got slaughtered for it, even though he could have trotted out 1,000 or 2,000 years of church history to support his position on feminism, the Reformed view on feminism, being against it, and the Reformed view of the historical problem with bagels. And so that's what we're looking at as we talk about these things. I talked to a buddy today, a lawyer friend, and he was saluting Spangler as well, and because he said anybody who wants to talk about this or wants to notice this, it's just like they're volunteering to have
Crucified.
What?
Crucified.
Yes, to have their legs cut off from underneath of them.
Absolutely. Which takes us back to the sin of noticing. We're just not allowed to do that. And
right.
So and I think I agree with you. I think that's exactly why this book is not being talked about, because I think they'd rather just make it go away, since he's laid out so many facts and it's their own sources of information.
Right. It's interesting. And he says, he quotes a Saturday Evening Post from in the 1960s. He says, actually, blockbusting probably is tougher on the whites than the Negroes. Nobody who has lived in the neighborhood for years, seen his children grow up there, remodeled his home exactly to his liking, and become accustomed to a nearby school, church, and shopping facilities, likes to be uprooted. Several elderly persons have died because of the anguish and upheaval involved. Once a block has been busted, some white owners simply stare, like Joe Biden in his debate with Trump, almost dumbfounded, which was like Joe Biden in his debate with Trump. As we draw up sale papers for them, others break down and cry. And that was the last thing I was waiting for Biden to do, is to break down and cry in that debate.
That's a whole nother podcast.
But yes, it's true. But Biden himself is on record as saying it's a good thing that whites are going to be in the minority. When he was vice president, I wish I had that YouTube clip to hit at this point. But he said with a panel of people that it was a good thing that whites were going to become a minority. And there are many people, again, that have said that.
Which, of course, is a big flip from his original position years and years and years and years ago, decades ago, as a senator or congressman. He took a very different stance when it came to
Kamala Harris,
issues.
even in their debates in 2020, accused him of basically being a racist. And she didn't use that word, but that's what she was pointing at. He was chummy too with Byrd. What was Byrd's first name? He was a longtime senator from West Virginia. Yeah. And they've noted that as well.
Well, and of course, I mean, you find out if you read in future chapters that he made his political bones over the issue of forced busing, and he was very much against it. And that's, of course, he's completely flipped on that. Yeah,
busing was. There are all kinds of issues that come in here. The civil rights issue he touches on. But again, the civil rights issue was driven by Marxist ideology. People don't know that, don't like to talk about it, but that's just the way it was. Busing, for example, it was funny. Busing was kind of funny in an odd way, because when the civil rights came down, all the Northerners, the Yankees, the New Englanders especially, they were like pointing their self-righteous finger at the South. But the busing issue came in a few years later, and all of a sudden that was in Boston and New England. And all of a sudden, they're now being told their kids have to intermix, so to speak, in these high schools. And we're going to bus kids all over the place. And all of a sudden, there are almost riots. I think there were riots in Boston during that era.
And they stopped their finger wagging at that point.
All right. So we talked about the liberal hypocrisy already, but he does say here, most damningly, recent research shows that white flight is actually the norm for white progressives who busily condemn everyone else for what they do themselves. This is the kind of thing that drives me absolutely bonkers. Here you are wagging your finger at me, and you're doing it's the same thing with the climate change stuff. Oh, the climate. Well, meanwhile, these guys are on their jets going all over the world, not thinking. Obviously, it's crapola. It's not true, but it's the truth that us little people have to live with.
Right. Yeah, Nancy Pelosi is not living in a predominantly black neighborhood.
Right. Yeah. Was that in this chapter?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I read that. And it did mention also that I think it was her father and brother were mayors of Baltimore. That's where she was from originally. And they were the ones that were shepherding this incredible demographic change in Baltimore. One thing that's interesting that I don't know that he points out in this book, but our cities. I challenge you, if you're interested in this, you can find this easily enough. Look at the demographic change in our major cities between 1960 and 1990, or you could even go from 1980 to 2020 if you wanted. The demographic change has been startling to see that we've changed out. It reminds me of the old Bertolt Brecht poem where he talks about what are we going to do with this situation? I know what we can do. We can vote in a new people. Instead of dealing with the government, voting a new government, the government's saying we can vote in a new people. And that's what exactly is going on with the whole immigration. You have to understand, I know that people find it hard to believe, but the intent here is to change out the demographics of America. This is all part of the globalistic New World Order push. People, when you start talking about that, people think, ooh, conspiracy time, tinfoil hat. But it's simply the case that this kind of immigration is going on uniquely in what countries? In the countries of former Christendom. And so obviously, again, this fight is not against whites so much as it is a proxy war against Christianity. We're going to dilute Christianity. We're going to dilute, and it's succeeding. You have to say it's succeeding. I just watched a brief documentary on Scotland and the drop in the Scottish population in terms of attendance of churches. It was heartbreaking. They're selling off churches in Scotland now that have been in existence for 9 to 1,000 years because why? There's nobody
attends.
Nobody to attend.
That's all over the West.
Yeah.
Yeah. The decline is significant.
Yeah. And well, that could lead us on another tangent as to why that's the case. And so they talk about this idea of redlining and Sam, I'm not good with numbers. Did you were able to understand what was going on here?
Redlining, yeah, he calls it something of an anti-white myth, and it basically describes it as redlining declares some neighborhoods as too risky for traditional mortgage lending, but he lets it be known that it was at least as much about social class as it was about race. And that whites were just as impacted by redlining neighborhoods as were blacks and other minorities, which that I didn't know anything. I hadn't heard anything about that. Yeah, he says something like 92% of homes in the lowest rated areas from redlining between 1930 and 1940 were owned by whites. Redlining did not just represent blind prejudice, but real payback risks. And of course, all of this really leads into the big push to get, I mean, it's the American dream, right? Get individual ownership. Maybe I'm moving on too fast. If I am, stop me. But to get the individual ownership of homes for everyone, which then, of course, led to the giving out of horrible loans to people who couldn't afford to pay it back, people inflating their salary when they're applying for those loans. And a lot of that happened not under Democratic rule, but it started with George Bush.
Right, in order to prove, just how non-racist he was.
Yeah.
So redlining is something that's often brought up, again, to prove how predatory the mean white man is. But what Carl does in his section on redlining is he demonstrates, as Sam has noted, that this was something that didn't only affect minority populations, it affected white populations as well. And there you might, once again, I mean, I like to point the finger at the banker class. I'm not a fan of the bankers. And they're the ones that are going to be profiting off of this whole matter.
And the fascinating thing is they profit when it's happening, and then when it fails and blows up, guess what? They still profit because the government bails them out. Right.
So they get all the profit with none of the risk. They're able, when it fails, what do? They pass the risks, they pass the cost onto the taxpayer. And that's another thing that if you're cognizant, that's another thing that should outrage you is how that works. Too big to fail. You've heard that phrase, but too big to fail means that you're going to be bailed out by the government. You're going to pay for the failures of these big banks, these big corporations. In the 70s, I can still remember the savings and loan crisis was the same way. You're going to be the one to pay them, but if they profit, you can be damn sure that you're not going to see any of that profit.
That is correct.
He goes on to the idea of forced busing, which we've already touched on briefly there. He does say that forced busing led to further neighborhood collapse, and it talks about how neighborhoods are ruined by this forced busing.
So, yeah, because then you get these families who they don't want to send their kid to a failing school or to a school that's got high crime and fights and bullying and all that sort of thing. And so it forces them to then send their kids to a private school at great financial cost to them, while at the same time, they're also the ones that are paying the lion's share of the taxes that support the public school. Right.
And so, again, is this really about not liking minorities, or is this about, hey, I want my kid to be in a safe environment? I was going to say a safe learning environment, but I don't think, I mean, it's been a long time since government schools have been doing much educating. So they want their children to be in a non-threatening environment. And when you see and you read what's going on in these schools today, it's just, you can't fault people for wanting to do that. They also talk about here about a wealth transfer. And I have this marked several places in Carl's book. The reason I mark the wealth transfer over and over again is because we still get all this noise about reparations. We have to give reparations to minorities, specifically the black community, because we've been so terrible. But what Carl shows throughout this book, although I don't think he points at it expressly, but over and over again, he points that there has been these wealth transfers that have been going on.
Oh,
we've already, if we had any sin, and I'm not saying that Americans don't have sin, but if we had the kind of sin that they're talking about, let's put it that way, we've paid many times over our reparations, so that the idea that we got to pay more reparations is just utter hooey.
In fact, you could make the argument that the rest of the book is talking about a number of those reparations that have been happening. I mean, all the ways that the government has been pushing for special privileges for everyone except for the white man.
Right, and that's something he tees up, I think, as I recall, at the very beginning of the book. When you talk about these set-asides, when you talk about these quotas, when you talk about the requirements they have to have X amount of minority students in the universities, all of that is code language for what? It's code language for discrimination against the white man. So it doesn't matter if the white kid at 18 years of age skyrockets on the SATs, has all kinds of pedigrees on his resume. He's not going to get ahead of somebody who's scoring lower with less pedigree if they're a minority. And that's why the whole idea that, what is that, power plus privilege equals what?
That's racism.
Yeah, that's racism. But that's why this idea of power plus privilege is nonsense, because the white man no longer, he's the one behind the 8 ball. And as long as he doesn't wake up to that fact, he's going to continue to go into decline. And it should be said here, I don't want the white European, I don't want them to rise at the cost of cutting off minorities at the knees. I just want a level playing field. And that's what's being taken away increasingly, especially when they start talking about bringing this new idea of diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Well, it's impossible.
Yeah. So when you talk about the DEI, or I like to call it DIE because it's easier to remember, die, it's no longer the case that you're arguing for equality. Now you're arguing that since white people have been advantaged, so the argument goes, for so many decades, what needs to be done is that they need to be pulled down, so that others can climb up on top of their shoulders, so to speak. Kamala Harris has come out and strongly in favor of that.
Because economically, it's a zero-sum game. You cannot have whites winning and everybody else winning too. It can't be
according
done.
to their prism.
According to their view of it. That's
right.
Correct.
Here I'm reading from page 65 in my book. It says whites are only about 14% of New York City and San Francisco public schools, but their parents make up the bulk of the wealthiest taxpayers, and they bear an enormous portion of the city's budgets, about half in New York City. This, of course, is true for almost all city services, which benefit all residents, but are paid for in great disproportion by white taxpayers. So that goes to what you were saying just a few minutes ago. What else can you call this except a wealth transfer? The white people are the ones that are bearing the load, and it's to the advantage of the minority community. And I told you earlier, folks, Carl commits the sin of noticing, and this is a classic example of the sin of noticing. We talked about Joe Biden earlier. Let's give a clip of a quote from him. Told a television interview in the late 70s, quote, this is Biden. That to me is the most racist concept you can come up with. What it says is, in order for your child with curly black hair, brown eyes, and dark skin to be able to learn anything, he needs to sit next to my blonde-haired, blue-eyed son. That's racist. Who the hell do we think we are? That the only way a black man or woman can learn is if they rub shoulders with my white child. Now, that was the Biden of the 70s, and I would agree with that. But the Biden, you can never get the Bidens of 2024 to make that statement.
No, now the Biden of 2024 is, if you don't vote for Biden, you're not black.
Right. I had forgotten that.
The fact that he said that, it's out there in the public, and it's totally okay. Nobody says anything.
I think there was one chap, Matt, you remember that guy named, he calls himself Charlemagne God?
Vaguely.
Yeah, I think Charlemagne God came out talking about that statement. Oh, I've forgotten that. He talks about the logic of Brown versus Board of Education, which, by the way, was a horrible decision. There's a book out by a chap named Kevin. I'm going to get his last name wrong. I think it's Guntzer, something like that. It's on the Constitution. He has one chapter on Brown versus Board of Education, and man, that was really terrible. He goes on to gentrification. You all know what gentrification is.
But before you hit that, just interestingly enough, Brown versus Board of Education is being flipped by their side now.
Right.
As increasingly they're moving towards segregation on campuses all across the country. Segregation when it comes to living spaces, segregation when it comes to study spaces, segregation when it comes to safe spaces, all that.
Also graduation ceremonies.
Graduation ceremonies, parties. What was that? Governor of Boston, mayor of Boston had that separate Christmas party.
Oh, yeah.
No whites allowed. Or
yeah,
they weren't invited.
I remember that, yeah. That is interesting, is okay, segregation was this terrible, terrible, evil thing, but now segregation in many quarters is, as Sam has noted, is being pursued. We want to be segregated.
And it's not being pursued by the white man.
Right. Although I don't fault anybody if they want to do that. I mean, that's one of the things that the civil rights thing destroyed in the Constitution, is this idea of freedom of association. We no longer have the right to freedom of association. In my opinion, if somebody doesn't want to serve somebody at their business, that's their right for freedom of association. It's their property. They can decide. If you don't like that, you can open up a business that competes with that. But again, freedom of association has been one of the casualties of this idea of making everything fair as part of civil rights, part of how we're going to solve the evils of the white man. And I'm here to tell you again, white man has fallen like anybody else, but the evils that get ascribed to him are largely made up, as Carl is pointing out over and over in this book. I don't want to roll over you, so
no, you're good.
Okay. The next section he goes into in There Goes the Neighborhood. That's the title of the chapter, is gentrification. And you all know what gentrification is. Sam, why don't you tee that up?
So gentrification, this is just a prime example of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And the white man is damned as being racist for leaving unsafe neighborhoods. And if they decide, hey, a bunch of us are going to move back in, we're going to make these properties nice, we're going to raise the values of the whole neighborhood. And guess what? You're a racist because you're coming in and you're taking over our neighborhood. So no winning.
Right, and so gentrification is going on in Detroit. They're doing some of that, especially around, as I recall, I may be wrong here, but around Tiger Stadium, or what used to be Tiger Stadium. I don't know what they call it now. I think that area has been gentrified.
There's large neighborhoods just here in Lansing that have been.
Oh, really?
Yeah, where a lot of white families have moved in, and they're kind of rebuilding up those neighborhoods. It's happening in big cities, in pockets. Not that Lansing's that big. But
He talks about a chap named Jeremy Greer, the co-founder and executive director of a racial justice nonprofit, mentions that the Affirmative Fair Housing Initiative, which we will have more to say later about, can be used to provide down payment boosts and low-interest loans to minority homeowners. And again, he says, can you imagine if races were reversed? Can you imagine if there was an organization that was committed to helping white people get down payment boosts and low-interest loans to white people? And he says, yet as one study showed that as neighborhoods gentrify, they also improve in many ways that may be as appreciated by their disadvantaged residents as their more affluent ones. And so he talks about gentrification, as Sam says, that's still racist. So really, we're in a box right now. What was that? Was that Schrodinger's cat? That whole experiment? Does that ring a bell? I'm probably getting in territory I shouldn't be getting into.
Well, I think it should be noted, though, that, I mean, you'll never hear anybody criticizing the Chinese for living in Chinatown. You'll never hear anybody criticizing the Hispanics for living in the barrio or the African Americans in Harlem. That would be ridiculous, right? That's their neighborhood, and that's where they live, and nor would we make fun of them for that. But if a white person moves in, they're racist. If a white person moves out, they're racist.
Right. And so the narrative that's being built and that we're all living in is it doesn't matter what the white man does. There'll be a way found to label him racist. So my mindset here,
and they have to, I mean, he points out, he says, only whites are expected to cheer their own ethnic mass displacement.
Right.
And then once displaced, never consider returning.
Right. And so my mindset here is, well, hell's bells. If we're going to be called a racist no matter what, we might as well earn the sobriquet. I mean, we might as well earn it. Now, obviously, it's half in jest, and not all in earnest. But you get tired of this word being slung around, racist, or the new word that they're trying to replace is kinist, or racial realist, or white supremacist. All these things are being put in the bag together. And once again, the intent here is not to engage in an argument. It's just to splatter you with a pejorative that scares everybody away.
To end the argument.
Right.
It stops all discussion altogether.
Right, because people are afraid that that's going to stick.
Yep.
They're afraid that the SBLC, and understandably so, that will come down and visit you. He then talks about how whites paid for the minority housing bailout. Of course, that would be another what? Wealth transfer.
Yep.
Again, another reason why we don't need to do reparations, because we already have done reparations. Sam mentioned earlier the Bush administration and how they were responsible for a lot of this irresponsible, almost giving houses. Hey, you walk in, you got a pulse, here, have a house. And then when you couldn't pay for it, it was white America who bailed you out. There's a bit of a section here I want to quote from. More than 4 times as many Hispanics by percentage of population were delinquent on their mortgages than whites. By modifying these mortgages, the Obama administration essentially handed hundreds of billions of dollars to these debtors. Ethnic minorities had a usually disproportionate share of the so-called subprime mortgages that were at the heart of the mortgage crisis. Default rates on mortgage issues between 2004 and 2007, which would form the heart of the subprime crisis, were issued to Hispanics at 31%, blacks at 28.2%, Asians at 14.7%, and whites at 12.1%. Alleged bunkers of the borrower-centric blame narrative point to Wall Street mortgage banker greed as the precipitating factors of the crisis, but both scenarios can be true. The greed was real, but the corrupt government policies as well meaning but destructive government policies enabled predominantly minority homeowners to make poor borrowing decisions. Regardless, the deck was stacked against the white middle class. So again, that's reparations. We have bailed people out, and we continue to be the butt of the joke. And because we're so intimidated by this cat call, this childish slinging of names like racist, white supremacist, kinist, because we're so afraid of that, I don't want to be called that. We're just allowing ourselves to be eaten alive by these piranhas. And yes, it does make me angry. And if you had half a mind in your head out there, listeners, you'd be angry about it too.
And note that the that it's predominantly the whites that are bailing out not only the people who have lost the houses and had bad loans, but also the banks. They're bailing out all of it, the whole system.
Right. They're the piggy bank. And you know what? You could interject here the golden goose fairy tale. I mean, the white man has been the golden goose, but eventually, if you kill the golden goose, he's no longer going to produce. She's no longer going to produce the golden eggs, and that's what's going to happen. And that's what socialism does. Is it never lifts. I mean, that's the whole purpose, or at least theoretically, that's the purpose of these kind of policies. We're going to lift. We're going to lift minorities up to the higher level, but that's not what's happening. What's happening instead is what? White people are being pulled down to the lower level. And that's the way socialism always works. It always wants to argue the fact that we're going to lift. No Child Left Behind was the same way. No Child Left Behind is that we're going to help all children, and most of the children that were being left behind were minorities. So we're going to help them. But what they didn't say is that No Child Left Behind also meant that no child gets ahead.
Every child left behind.
Yeah, every child. Again, that's socialism. And that's what we're working at here. And this is why it drives me nuts when and I'm going to go on a little tangent here, forgive me. It drives me nuts when I hear that sources close to the situation have informed me that there was an OPC minister named Matt Holst who said that he was a socialist and they ordained him anyway. Socialism is a different religion. How can you be a clergy ordained and be a self-avowed socialist? Like I said, it's a little rabbit trail. The next section is entitled Affirmatively Destroying Mostly White Communities.
Interesting that started by President Obama, cut off by the Trump administration, and then restored by the Biden administration.
Right. And you have to understand the reason for that is the Democratic Party right now is an anti-white party. If you're white and you're voting for Democrats, you're stupid because they are warring against any interest you have. They cannot be elected without major percentages in the minority community voting for them.
One might make the argument that if you're not white and you vote for the Democratic Party, you're stupid.
Yes. Yes, because it really isn't. I mean, only a handful, the race pimps, they get ahead by all these policies.
Oh, everybody's equal, but some are more equal
Right.
than
And
others.
don't forget, gentlemen, if you don't vote for Biden, you're not black.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so some have observed, for example, on this trail that if the Republicans would quit trying to ape the Democrats a little bit in order to gain minority vote, and if they just went after the white vote, if they could only get 2 or 3% more of the white vote, they would win every time. But instead, they're trying to be Democrat light.
Play the game.
Yeah, play the game instead of, and I think it's Steve Saylor actually. Steve, if you're out there listening, I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting you, but I think it was Saylor who's the one who said, who I read, if they would just go for a few more percentages of the white vote, then they would get elected. So again, I've looked at these numbers. Typically in presidential election cycles, somewhere in the vicinity of 92% of blacks vote for Democrats. Somewhere in the vicinity of 70% plus Jews vote for Democrats. It's the same thing with the Hispanic community. The numbers are way up there. And what these people seem to forget is that once a political party thinks they have you in their pocket,
they move on.
Yeah, there's no reason to any longer really to look out for you, to take care of you, because they're just assuming that your vote is theirs.
Which has got some Democratic operatives a little bit nervous now with all that's going on with Israel and Palestine and the pro-Palestinian movement within the Democratic Party. They're starting to go, oh, wait a minute, we might have to back off that a little bit, but they're not. They're not backing off it.
Right. Whitmer even came out today, and I think it's very self-serving, but she came out today and said because of the Arab vote in the Dearborn area, the east side of the state, the Palestinian sentiment, that Michigan cannot be won by Biden. Now, and this is, again, we're on a rabbit trail here, but the reason that this is self-serving is, of course, if Biden can't run, if Biden can't win, there's a lot of people that's talking about Gretchen Whitmer to fill that 2024 presidential slot.
Lord have mercy on us all.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I say on that is at least she's out of Michigan at that point, but now we're all being cursed with her. All right. So again, the last section is affirmatively destroying mostly white communities. That's always been the game. They talk about the organization called the AFFH, which is the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. Whenever you hear the word fair, you know that it's going to be unfair.
They're going after those equal outcomes, which is impossible.
Right.
It is impossible to have equal outcomes.
Right. That's why America, you go back to de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville noted this, what many others has as well, is that America was built upon the thesis of a meritocracy. Those people who can bring the most, have the most talents, the most skill, work the hardest, they're the ones that can get ahead. But we've long left the meritocracy anymore, and now it's this idea of equality, and now even worse, equity. And it's destroying America. We're going to wake up and we're going to realize that we're not going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And I don't like to get into politics. I'm not voting for Trump or Biden, but I will say this: if the Democrats get majorities in House, Senate, and the White House back, I don't see how we survive another 4 years. I do have one asterisk. As I read, I'm a big underliner. I also put asterisks, stuff that's really important, and if it's really, really important, I'll put notes in my book. But this Fair Housing Administration in the White House, they give an example in heavily white Dubuque, Iowa. Rather than giving preference to their own residents in public housing, they must advertise to African-American residents from several hours away in Chicago. Simply put, if your community is too white for housing and urban development, you can expect to be targeted. Right? And E. Michael Jones has a book where he talks about how the ethnic communities were purposely destroyed by the feds, by their policy. But clearly now what they're doing now is they're trying to do the same thing to white communities. They're trying to make sure they're not white anymore. And again, this is the idea of tinkering with freedom of association. Anything more you want to add on this chapter? Anything at all, Sam?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, we're glad that you joined us for this episode of Iron Rhetoric. And I trust that part of what's going on is that lights are turning on. I mean, what Carl has done, he's done us a favor. People don't want to talk about these issues, but guess what? We need to talk about these issues. I mean, it's like watching your child dying and just saying to yourself, oh, they're okay. They're okay. They'll eat the next meal. They'll get up and play tomorrow. If we don't start addressing and talking about these issues, we're toast. And remember, as I said at the outset, really what's being gone after here is not white people so much as biblical Christianity. People don't like making that connection because they say, again, it's racist, but that's what's going on. So we thank you for tuning in, and we'll continue to look at this in subsequent weeks. That is Jeremy Carl's book, and we strongly recommend that you buy a volume and read it for yourself. Maybe it'll set you on fire and make you resolve to say, hey, I need to stand up and start talking about these things. But the thing I'd have you talk more about anything else is the supremacy and the lordship of Jesus Christ. Taking on the supremacy and owning the lordship of Jesus Christ and moving in terms of his authority, whether you're white, black, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're Japanese, whether you're Asian, Korean, whether you're bagel, if you own Jesus Christ and walk in terms of his law authority and his law word, and you trust to his grace, these things will find themselves diminishing. I'm not going to say they're going to go away because what? Man has fallen. He's always going to have problems. But as long as we're being humanist, as long as we're being man-centered, anybody who has the aroma of Jesus Christ about them, as the white man has had by God's grace alone through the centuries, he's going to be attacked. And the only way that can be solved is by speaking up Jesus Christ. Amen. So we thank you for joining us, and Godspeed and good night.
Can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.